of the dead men. As dawn broke on August 6, 1915, the air thickened with tension as a sinister green cloud crept ominously across the landscape. What followed was a scene straight out of a horror movie that would haunt the nightmares of those who witnessed it. The toxic gas had been drifting over the old Russian imperial fortress of Auschwitz in what is now northeastern Poland. The fortress was in the middle of difficult-to-pass swampland, a passageway from Germany into deeper Russia. With the outbreak of hostilities, the Germans and the Russians fought bitterly, inflicting devastating casualties in a series of offensives and counteroffensives. In September 1914, the Germans launched their first attack against Auschwitz, sending 40 battalions of the 8th Army to overwhelm the fortress. In spite of being greatly outnumbered, the Russians managed to throw back the initial assault, counterattacking the Germans with 2 flanking maneuvers, which forced them to withdraw. The Germans would try again in February of 1915, this time wheeling up heavy artillery pieces to blast the obstinate fortress into dust. At least one of these pieces was a giant 420mm siege mortar, nicknamed Big Bertha, along with many other smaller pieces. The Germans rained shells on Auschwitz Fortress for months, dropping over 1 million shells, but the Russians still did not give in. In July of 1915, the German war effort in the east was taken over by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, hero of the crushing victory at the Battle of Tannenberg. With the new leadership came a new strategy to finally deal with the stubborn Russians in Auschwitz. Hindenburg brought up 14 battalions to overwhelm the fortress, along with 30 batteries of gas artillery, 30 large siege guns, a sapper battalion, and specialist troops who were trained to breach fortifications. In total, around 7,000 German soldiers were sent to eliminate the stubborn Russian defenders. Facing this force was a garrison made up of the 226th Zemlyansk Regiment, as well as some units of militia, around 900 men in total. For weeks, the fortress was bombarded relentlessly, the Germans shooting thousands of artillery rounds, but the Russians again refused to surrender, and the attackers were growing increasingly frustrated with their lack of progress. In early August, German leadership authorized the use of the most infamous weaponry of the First World War. In addition to the regular high-explosive artillery shells, the Germans also had access to a large quantity of chlorine and bromine gas, and waited for an opportunity to use it. Chlorine gas is a devastating chemical agent that was first used as a weapon at Ypres in April 1915 against the British. It's a pale green-yellow gas that is much heavier than air, which means that a cloud will hover at ground level rather than dissipate into the atmosphere. When it comes into contact with moisture, such as in the eyes, mouth, or lungs, it turns into hydrochloric acid, a corrosive chemical that damages the surrounding tissue and can lead to death if inhaled in sufficient quantities. Lower doses can lead to eye irritation, respiratory distress, and vomiting. One of the major flaws of chlorine gas as a weapon is that it's easy to spot, being a pale green cloud, and has a distinctive odor, described as a combination of pineapple and pepper. This gave those under a gas attack an opportunity to take countermeasures, such as moving to higher ground or donning their gas masks. On August 6, 1915, at around 4 a.m., the wind and weather conditions were right, and the Germans launched their attack, firing a barrage of conventional artillery shells while also deploying the deadly gas from 30 batteries. The effects were apparent even before the gas reached the Russian lines. As the sickly pale green cloud inexorably crept forward at ground level, grass turned black and leaves in trees instantly turned yellow as the contained moisture turned into hydrochloric acid. Birds and insects fell to the ground dead as the cloud moved on. Copper plating on guns and shells were corroded on contact, turning to chlorine oxide. When the cloud reached the Russian lines, the men inhaled the deadly toxin. The Russians had a few gas masks which were in poor condition, and not enough for all the men, so were forced to use rags covered in water or urine tied around their noses and mouths to protect against the poison. Chlorine gas is water-soluble, so this can mitigate some of the toxicity before it enters the lungs or mouth, but this is obviously far from ideal. The gas reacted on contact with moist surfaces, the hydrochloric acid dissolving tissue in the eyes, mouth, and lungs. Russian soldiers began coughing uncontrollably as their respiratory system was being eaten alive. Many coughed up blood, scores died during the onslaught, and after months of effort, the way into Osijek was clear. Capitalizing on the Russians' confusion, the Germans formed up and wearing gas masks, 14 battalions began their assault on the fortress, their artillery guns stopping to avoid hitting their own men. As they made their way across no man's land, the discolored and silent landscape bore testimony to the destructive power of the chlorine. They were expecting little, if any, resistance from the Russians, who bore the brunt of the noxious cloud. They were mistaken. As they approached, the German soldiers, expecting an easy victory, were faced with a horrifying sight. Instead of dead enemies, inexplicably, the Russians were launching a bayonet attack. In spite of the tremendous toll the gas had taken, some of the Russian soldiers were still alive. Sub-Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinsky was the highest-ranking survivor and organized the remaining Russian defenders for a counterattack. The surviving members of the 8th and 13th Company formed up and were charging towards the advancing Germans. There were only around 100 who managed to countercharge, not nearly enough to repel the attackers. Their attack was not only physical, but also psychological. In what must have looked like a nightmare made real, the Russian soldiers must have looked like a horde of the undead, stumbling and shambling forwards, clutching corroded weapons, blood leaking from irritated eyes, fresh blood staining their uniforms as they closed the distance with the Germans. From the German perspective, it seemed as if the dead had returned to life to oppose them, and rather than finishing off vulnerable soldiers, were facing a horde of newly risen zombies. Seeing this horrific sight of the dead now charging towards them, panic gripped the Germans, whose attack stalled out in the face of the onslaught. Terror gripped the men, and many turned and ran in fear, heedless of everything except getting away. In some cases, they were so frightened that they became caught in their own barbed wire defenses. Some of the surviving Russians in the fort managed to fire the 5 remaining artillery pieces, further adding to the confusion. The once confident advance became a rout, and the attack on Osijek once again ended in failure. In spite of their heroics, the garrison was in terrible shape, with the vast majority of the 900 men killed, wounded, or incapacitated by the gas attack. Many who participated in the attack of the dead men, as newspapers would later call it, succumbed to their injuries. 2 weeks after the attack, the fortress, which had been a thorn in the side of the Germans, was abandoned. Though it never fell to the enemy directly, German successes on other sections of the front threatened to surround and cut off Osijek. The Germans would occupy the location until 1919, not seeing any further fighting. It would transfer to Polish authority and then be controlled by the Red Army during World War II until overrun by the Wehrmacht. After the war, control was again transferred to the Polish military. Today, some parts of the fortress are still under control of the Polish military, though a portion of the site is open to tourists, a monument to one of the stranger and more horrific events in a war known for its devastation and carnage.
Paranormal encounters in World War I. The 1,000-yard stare, the blank, emotionless expression soldiers displayed after experiencing the horrors of war, can be seen in countless faces in photographs from World War I. Detached and emotionally distant from reality, soldiers appear to be staring off into the distance, looking out into another world. Psychologists explain this phenomenon as a way trauma victims allow their brain to detach from their horrendous surroundings and cope with the stresses in their environment. Shell shock, another name for men showcasing these symptoms of confusion, fatigue, and impaired sight or hearing abilities could render even the strongest person disheveled and helpless. It is no surprise then that these same battle-weary soldiers, with minds full of the horrors of war, claimed to see ghosts, ghouls, and even aliens in the dark recesses of battlefields. Today, we would say that these men were suffering from a stress reaction to constant bombardment, death, and chaos. However, at the time, shell shock and the 1,000-yard stare were seen as signs of cowardice and lack of moral fiber. Therefore, many soldiers did not receive the treatment they desperately needed to heal their ailing minds. In examining the paranormal encounters from the front lines of World War I, it is best to remember how broken and panicked the minds of the men who reported them were. Wild men/ghouls. One of the creepiest tales among soldiers fighting in World War I was the myth of wild men who lived in no man's land. It was believed that crazed, unhinged bands of deserters inhabited the haze of battlefields. Soldiers often reported seeing dark figures moving swiftly across the horizon line at night. These ghouls, as many men described them, supposedly sunk down in the mud to avoid being seen and only emerged from their hiding spots to loot dead bodies, or by some accounts, to feed upon corpses. Theories about the wild men differed, with some maintaining that they were soldiers who renounced war and were just trying to survive, and others who believed that there truly were cannibalistic lunatics who stalked around battlefields at night. Perhaps a very real reason for the origin of this story was officers' intention to scare soldiers away from deserting their post. If men were convinced that monsters in the mist lurked just outside their lines, they would be more hesitant to run for the hills when the thick of battle overcame them. What doesn't help the tale's believability is that the earliest record of the story came from a 1920 memoir, only becoming a sensation well after the war had ended. Red Baron and the UFO. Famed German fighter pilot Baron Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, is mostly known for his stunning accomplishments against Allied aircraft and universally recognized flying capabilities. However, he is also known for possibly shooting down a UFO in 1917 in a Fokker triplane. Fellow German pilot Peter Weitstrick recalls how he and the Red Baron came across an aircraft like an upside-down saucer during an early morning mission over Belgium and immediately opened fire on it. The Red Baron hit the unusual-looking aircraft and watched as it violently crashed through the trees and hit the ground below. Astonishingly, it is reported that two humanoid figures frantically exited the UFO and raced into the woods. It should be mentioned, though, the story first appeared in a satirical magazine called Weekly World News in 1999. And as Patrick Gross has found, there is no record of a Peter Weitstrick having ever existed. Moreover, the Fokker triplane the Red Baron was said to have used did not exist yet. Richthofen was known to have been using his deadly Albatros D3 at that time instead. The Valkyrie. First spotted by Lieutenant Frederick Ardsley, flying a patrol route in northern France when he saw an identical Scout Experimental 5 biplane next to him. The Valkyrie was a female pilot with long golden hair. According to Ardsley, she removed her goggles, let out a piercing laugh, and stared at him with cornflower blue eyes before blowing him kisses and performing a can-can dance on the edge of her cockpit. Ardsley attempted to keep up with her, but her abilities were too great and she easily outmaneuvered him. At one point, the Valkyrie's aircraft, which featured a golden symbol for Venus on the fuselage, climbed into a bank of clouds at an altitude of 20,000 feet, and Ardsley was forced to make a controlled dive back down because his plane stalled. The legend was catapulted into the press when German pilot Albert Roll claimed that he had been shot down by a red-nosed SE-5 biplane that was flown by a a woman with blonde hair. Soon, many other German pilots claimed to have seen a ferocious female pilot who hunted the skies with unparalleled skills. However, Arch Whitehouse, the World War I veteran and aviation novelist, had a different take. Whitehouse believed that the Valkyrie myth began as a joke between young pilots who were trying to lighten up the dreariness of war. Supposedly, these pilots decided to put on a theatrical performance at Christmas for a squadron party, and some were forced to dress up as women for the play. Jumping into the cockpits of their biplanes, the men dressed as women got quite a laugh from their comrades, and the enduring image of a bombshell blonde piloting an aircraft began. According to the historian Nigel Watson, however, there's no evidence of Ardsley having existed either. Further, the lieutenant is said to have been in the 49th Squadron, which did not use SE-5 biplanes. Ghost at Ypres. On a December night in 1915, near Ypres in Belgium, a man named William Spate was enjoying another bitterly cold night in the trenches when the most unexpected thing happened to him. Sitting down by a faint candlelight, Spate felt the presence of another in his company. Turning, Spate was horrified to find the ghost of his friend, who he had seen die on the battlefield. The apparition of his friend said nothing to him and disappeared just as quickly as he had been standing in front of Spate. The next night, Spate asked for another officer to sit with him in case the ghost of his friend reappeared. To his surprise, the ghost reappeared, only this time with a message for him. Motionless, it pointed to a spot on the floor, before vanishing once again. Not knowing what to make of this, Spate ordered some of his men to dig a hole where the ghost had pointed. Miraculously, the soldiers found a tunnel had been dug under them and rigged with massive amounts of explosives. The bombs were quickly defused, and the soldiers thanked the specter who had saved them. This incident was first described in a 1919 war-themed short story competition for Pearson's magazine. It gained credibility when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle referenced it in his History of Spiritualism collection. Cossacks in Britain. Civilians, not just soldiers, were also capable of experiencing paranormal encounters. One of the most interesting records of mass hysteria comes from the persistent myth among British civilians that millions of Cossacks from the Russian army were on their way to Britain. First, in late August 1914, local newspapers reported sightings of fierce-looking men with beards and fur hats traveling on trains through Britain. Then, the stories gained traction, and international newspapers were soon detailing how almost 1 million Russian soldiers were passing through Britain on their way to France. People everywhere were claiming to find traces of the Russians. Stories of chocolate machines jammed up by rubles, warriors marching toward London Bridge Station, and cries for vodka from train cars were soon on everyone's lips. When British intelligence services learned the rumors were false, they did not censor them, which aided the Allies, as a cautious German command committed 2 divisions to guard the Belgian coast against the supposed Cossack reinforcements. Unknown to the Germans and the general populace in the US and Britain, there was no great Russian army moving against Germany from Britain. Only after the Germans made a tactical retreating move that cost them the battle at Marne did the British government issue a statement that the stories of Cossacks in Britain were fake. However, by this time, the story had gotten so big that many continued to believe it. In reality, there were indeed massive amounts of soldiers traveling from the north of Britain to the southern ports, but they were British reservists. These battalions had been given orders to pull the shades down on their train carriages and travel at night to keep their whereabouts a secret. Furthering the myth, some battalions of the British force spoke thick dialects, such as Gaelic, which many mistook as Russian. When studying the myths and paranormal encounters of World War I, it is more tragic than scary to see how war affected their minds and ensured that there were no survivors. Everyone who participated in World War I was a casualty of the war and had to carry the burden of their trauma with them for the rest of their life. While modern audiences can look at these soldiers' ghost stories and find a plausible explanation for the men involved, there was no explanation for the senseless violence, destruction, and chaos they lived through every day. As everything they thought they knew about themselves and the world around them was shattered, everything became possible, from aliens to ghosts.
Terrifying things to see in war. War reveals the darkest aspects of human existence, with scenes of suffering and devastation that linger in our collective consciousness. Throughout history, war has showcased the depths of human cruelty and the toll of violence and its long-lasting effects on the psyche. Although every part of war could be deemed a horrifying sight, from civilian experiences to soldiers, certain occasions add an even worse layer of horror as people suffer through the most unimaginable things other human beings are capable of inflicting. Napalm, the Vietnam War. Napalm is a horrifying jellied substance that sticks to its victims like glue, burning through flesh, blood, and bone. While napalm's first documented military use as an air raid bomb was toward the end of World War II in 1944 and during the Korean War, it really found its horrific stride during Vietnam. The consequences of the use of napalm were so disturbing that the United Nations actually banned its use on civilian targets in 1980 at the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. In papers, shocking images emerged of innocent men, women, and children burnt and dying from napalm's horrendous effects. Napalm B, the type used in Vietnam, was easy to make, even referred to as bathtub chemistry, and Dow Chemical won the bid laid out by the Pentagon in 1965 to become the U.S.'s sole supplier. By 1966, they were using it as a key weapon in Vietnam. It's estimated that in that year alone, 4,500 tons were dropped monthly across Indochina. At its peak in 1968, that monthly total was increased to a massive 5,900 tons, continuing to be used in earnest until 1973. In total, it was a 91.6% increase in the amount used during the 3 years of the Korean War. Described in one news report as a continuous sheet of flames half a mile wide, the incoming onslaught of these jelly bombs was a sight made from nightmares. Seeing its aftermath was no better. A now famous photo depicted the horror and tragedy napalm caused. A young girl running with other children, her face captured in a scream and her clothes completely burnt away. Incredibly, unlike many others, the girl in the photo, Kim Phuc Phan Thi, survived and went on to write the harrowing tale of her experiences with napalm. Napalm scorched my clothing, and then my skin, and then the fat and muscle and other tissue that had once thrived in layers below my skin. That because I would and forever be seen as different. The main reason napalm was so effective was because it stuck, burning and unrelenting to everything it touched, including human skin. And water would do nothing to douse the flames. In fact, it partially combusts oxygen, so trying to relieve the burning caused by napalm could actually cause it to ignite all over again. Many died from exposure, the blast effect or respiratory failure caused by the substance, with others living in agony covered in burns until multi-organ failure would take them away. From seeing the dreaded flames of napalm raining down to the horrors of watching its aftermath, it remains one of the worst weapons in history because of the utter unimaginable pain and inhuman devastation it causes. Hill 303. Many atrocities occurred during the Korean War that raged from 1950 to 1953. After the North Korean People's Army attacked the South without warning, they committed a series of war crimes that are considered some of the worst in recorded history. One of which was what occurred on Hill 303 in August of 1950. Under pressure from the advancing Korean troops, a U.S. squad found themselves waiting for reinforcements to help them defend a point not far from Hill 303. When Americans saw a group of soldiers appear, they thought that help had arrived, until they realized that these Korean soldiers were not allies and were in fact heavily armed Red troops. Quickly, they lost control of the situation, and the lieutenant in charge of the squad gave the order for the U.S. soldiers to surrender. This should have meant that they became prisoners of war. Initially, that was how things seemed, given water, cigarettes, and extremely minimal rations of an apple for multiple men to share. Their lot wasn't good, but there was nothing to suggest that these Korean Red troops had more sinister objectives in mind. That is, until they heard nearby U.S. mortar fire. Forcing their prisoners to take off their shoes, they bound each soldier with their hands behind their backs, marching toward Naktong. We only know what happened next because of the accounts of a few brave survivors. PFC Roy Manring was only 18 years old when he was forced into a ditch next to his squad mates, hands still tied. As the Reds stood over them, they raised their burp guns and mercilessly shot to kill the defenseless surrendered soldiers. As Manring saw the others fall, he was saved by his quick thinking and intense bravery. After being shot in the leg, he was forced to lie under the body of a fallen comrade, smearing blood on his face to make himself look as though he too had been successfully gunned down. Manring reported hearing the footsteps as the Red troops came back along the line, indiscriminately shooting among the corpses to ensure no one was left alive. Despite being hit again by a bullet, this time in the arm, Manring managed to not cry out, a move that probably saved his life. But seeing comrades shot in cold blood and then forced to lie among their remains is one of the most horrific sights and experiences anyone could have in war. Manring was just lucky he lived to tell the tale. And he wasn't the only one. In the end, 4 soldiers survived the ordeal, although each surely had to deal with the aftermath of their experience and the horrifying sights that happened on Hill 303. Perhaps it's inevitable that human beings will always look for ways to cause each other harm and trauma, at least in the case of serious war and conflict. However, there are some moments that stand out as the worst in human history, for the depths of their depravity and the long-lasting effects on those who had to witness the horrific outcomes. Jewish death marches, World War II. By the summer of 1944, it became pretty clear to the Germans that their chances of winning World War II were extremely slim. And when they did lose, one horrific fact of the regime would be laid bare for the world to see: the concentration camps of the Holocaust. While there were many horrific and inhumane sights waiting for the liberators of the camps, one of the final injustices against Jewish people in Nazi-occupied countries was observed by many who could never forget what they saw: the death marches. Although death marches had occurred earlier on in World War II, in 1944 the number hugely increased, leading to thousands upon thousands of tragic deaths. After the Soviets took over the concentration camp Lublin, Heinrich Himmler ordered all concentration camp members outside Germany to be marched towards the interior of the Reich. The marches themselves were composed of Jewish people, prisoners of war, and enemies of Nazi Germany. From Himmler's perspective, there were 3 reasons to evacuate the camps and begin this approach. 1, he and other SS members didn't want the world to know their story, the horrors they had seen and suffered at the hands of the most vicious and devoted of Nazis. 2, they still believed they could be useful in producing armaments for the war effort. 3, they were convinced they could use them as a bargaining chip against the Allies to ensure the survival of Nazism after the war. While on paper, this may seem better than a concentration camp, the reality was horrific. Thousands were forced into walking further than was really possible, under unbearable conditions and abuse from their Nazi torturers. When they removed the prisoners of the Stutthof camp, for example, 7,000 Jewish people were forced to march for 10 days. In total, in just the 2 months of March and April in 1945, 250,000 out of 700,000 concentration camp prisoners were forced on death marches. A lucky few escaped the death marches, and one man in particular escaped twice. 18-year-old Dave Hirsch dragged through 2 separate death marches and lived to tell the tale. Those who survived to tell the tale have since shared their tragic stories of the horrors they witnessed. Denied food and water, the elderly, incapable, or injured fell behind and were brutally shot in front of their fellow marchers. We walked for days, I'll never forget it. The ravines and gutters were all red from blood. We saw people being shot in the front of the chest, in the back. There were people lying on top of hills, in trees. It was really like a war zone. On some marches, as many as 1 in 4 died. In others, like Stutthof, it was even worse. Of the 7,000 that started that death march, few survived. Those who lived through the treacherous journey were murdered when they reached the Baltic Sea. The atomic bomb. One of the most horrifying sights in war is shared by military and civilian alike. Seeing a dreaded canister fall out of the bottom of a bomber plane, knowing the inevitable will happen when it strikes the ground. This is doubly true for those individuals who were unlucky enough to be in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945, when the US dropped the atomic bombs on Japanese civilians, a decision that is still viewed as highly controversial today. In fact, 56% of Americans asked in 2015 said they still thought the bombing was justified, in comparison to only 14% of Japanese people. The intention of the drop was in no small part a revenge ploy by the US for the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, but officially it was to save the lives of citizens of America and Japan by forcing a quick end to the war. Survivors of the attack have spoken extensively about their experience, what they saw when the bomb hit, and the tragedy of what happened next. One man, Tsutomu Yamaguchi, was unlucky enough to be caught up in both bombings, having escaped Hiroshima only to be in Nagasaki when the second bomb hit. In his only British interview years later, he described a huge mushroom-shaped pillar of fire rising high into the sky. But the common description remained the same in the moments after the bombs fell, a blinding white magnesium light. Of course, for the survivors, that moment of confusion that accompanied the light wasn't the worst part of being in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the aftermath. Chaos, panic, debris, and destruction, people injured and dying as they tried to make sense of what had just happened, something that had never happened before in the whole of human history. A nuclear weapon had been dropped on civilian cities, and the ramifications of it would reverberate for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath, the sights were visceral and haunting. The burned and dying with skin literally peeling away, begging for water. Those poisoned by the radiation, sick, blistered, and dying in the street. Children and babies murdered in an instant by the impact. It was estimated up to 200,000 died from the bombs, and over the ensuing decades, thousands more experienced terminal illnesses like cancer as a result of their proximity to the bombing. As bodies floated down the rivers and survivors picked their way through the destroyed areas of the city, they may have thought the worst was over, but they had more yet to endure. In the following years, many more died from the long-term effects of radiation poisoning and other health issues. In Hiroshima, over 70% of buildings were leveled, and in Nagasaki, its estimated temperatures when the bomb fell reached 4,000 degrees centigrade, literally burning people's eyes from their sockets as they died. To this day, survivors and their children campaign to ensure something like this never happens again. Cavalry charges. Soldiers in war see many unspeakable horrors, from comrades dying next to them in foxholes to the traumatic sights of those affected by mustard gas, trench foot, and other common wartime ailments. But there's something particularly captivatingly horrible about being borne down upon by legions of men on horseback. Cavalry charges have been used in war since antiquity, and surprisingly continued during World War II. But instead of facing down infantrymen who would stand with spears and shields or cannons and slow-loading singular guns, they instead faced legions of machine guns and mortars capable of tearing them and their mounts to shreds. It may not have felt as horrifying to those soldiers facing down the cavalry charge, but in earlier centuries, infantrymen would have felt the same way. Despite cannon fire and muskets, the famous poem Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson surmised how it felt to face down these cavalry members. flashed all their sabers bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabering the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem is such a landmark in literary history that it's inspired multiple other pieces of media, including an Iron Maiden song, The Trooper. This refers to the infamous battle of the British against Russian forces in the Crimea War and the tactical failure of the commanders in organizing the attack. But while many of the men may not have survived the assault, the sight of them all charging at breakneck speed toward the firing line must have been an awe-inspiring sight. Medieval biological warfare. Way back in medieval times, a popular battle tactic was siege warfare. Typically, any major strategic point or town had some sort of castle system. Originally the traditional motte and bailey design, these defensive fortifications later evolved with small towns living within the castle walls themselves, protected by strong stone outer walls and multiple layers of defense. The most common form of war in medieval times, siege battles, adopted the wait-and-see approach. Rather than attacking outright, often an invading force would usually surround the castle walls and simply wait out its inhabitants, who would be forced to act as supplies ran short. Once weakened, the invaders would attack. Did you know in 1271, Mamluk Sultan Baybars seized a Crusader fortress from the Knights Hospitaller through a clever trick? Through a forged letter allegedly from the Knights' commander, he ordered the garrison within the fort to surrender, and they did. Of course, with this new form of warfare, so too came new forms of weapons, siege weapons. These would include giant battering rams for knocking down city gates, trebuchets, perriers, and mangonels that would fire huge stones at the walls, damaging buildings and striking fear within, and siege towers that could be pushed up against the castle walls for soldiers to climb over the armaments and attack. But one of the lesser used, yet more horrifying tactics would truly have been the most harrowing to see. Some medieval accounts suggest that instead of stones, the trebuchets would be used to fling human and animal remains over the walls into the castle grounds. The most famous, albeit disputed account of this was during the 1346 siege of Caffa by Genoese Gabriele de Mussi. The siege was the result of long, uneasy relations between Caffa's Genoese traders and the Mongols, during which the bodies of the dead were flung over the walls by trebuchet. Although it's now been established de Mussi's account was likely second-hand, it contains enough information to be presumed likely true. And what more horrifying sight could there be than bodies flung through the air to land crumpled at someone's feet as they remain more or less trapped inside their fortifications? Well, if those bodies were covered in the pustules of bubonic plague, it would almost certainly be more horrifying, which is apparently exactly what they were. In fact, some historians blame the siege of Caffa for the spread of the Black Death into Europe and the subsequent hold the plague took. While this may not be quite true, it certainly didn't help slow the deadly tide. De Mussi describes the scene at Caffa as mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. In close quarters, it didn't take long for the highly contagious disease to spread from the dead to the living. This means that for the people of Caffa, what many saw in their last days was the horrifying sight of real human remains flying over armaments and castle walls to thud heavily on the ground, covered in evidence of the plague that would soon come for them. This is not the only time there are accounts of human corpses used in psychological and biological warfare in the medieval era. In several major battles, there are reports of trebuchets being used to fling horse carcasses and human remains towards castles in an attempt to defeat them in a siege. Psychological sonic weapons. Some weapons are not designed to kill or maim the enemy, but rather to instill fear. If done effectively, frightened soldiers no longer wish to fight, but instead flee the horrors of combat. A key component often built into these weapons of fear is the noise they create, with many specifically designed to trigger psychological effects simply through intense or unsettling noise. In turn, they prey on human susceptibility to intense auditory overstimulation and psychological reaction. Number 1. Aztec Death Whistle. In 1999, an archaeological discovery in Mexico City revealed what may in fact have been one of the earliest examples of a sound-based weapon. While excavating a temple dedicated to Ehecatl, the Aztec wind god, archaeologists found a sacrificed skeleton of a young man who in his hands was holding 2 whistles. It was assumed the whistles were there to imitate the winds of the underworld. Researchers soon labeled these unusual finds as the Aztec death whistle. As archaeologists continued to piece together information about the whistle and how it was used, other theories of its use in combat began to arise. It's likely that these weren't just instruments used during human sacrifices, because given the horrifying scream it produced in reconstructions, it may have been used as a weapon of war. The death whistle is categorized as an air spring type of whistle, with earlier versions having been found from the Mayans. In the case of the Aztec death whistle, it sounds like someone being flayed alive. When we imagine the image of thousands of Aztec warriors marching into battle, armed with spiked clubs and spears and blowing these death whistles, it's easy to see just how effective this object could have been in terrorizing the enemy. Number 2. The Trumpets of Jericho, Stuka Sirens. When referencing the German Air Force of World War II, Junkers Ju-87 are perhaps one of the first aircraft that come to mind, being one of the most notable and well-recognized aircraft of the entire war. The famous Stuka dive bomber and ground attack aircraft was used during the Spanish Civil War as part of the German Condor Legion, and during the early years of World War II as part of Germany's Blitzkrieg tactics. The Battle of Britain soon revealed the drawbacks of the Stuka bombers, of which the most important was its considerably low speed, making it incompatible for air-to-air combat. As the war went on, and with German air supremacy faltering, the Stuka's role in the war similarly gradually declined. However, for one key reason, the Junkers Ju-87 remained a symbol of the Blitzkrieg. All those who faced the aircraft remember one thing about them: the noise they made. Stukas were built with an interesting feature installed on their fuselage. There were 2 propeller-driven sirens attached to the undercarriage legs at 2.3 feet in diameter. When the aircraft would enter a dive, the siren would produce a loud screaming sound. As the diving speed increased, the noise intensified. The sirens were symbolically therefore named the Trumpets of Jericho. Ironically, the enemy soldiers were not the only ones affected by the sirens. German pilots found them disturbing too, especially while conducting a complicated diving procedure. Another drawback was that the sirens actually decreased the speed by between 10 and 20 miles per hour, or 20 to 25 kilometers an hour. Eventually, the sirens were withdrawn from use, but the Trumpets of Jericho remained a prominent symbol of the war. Number 3. Stalin's Organs, BM-13 Katyusha. The BM-13 Katyusha's use as a sound-based weapon was accidental and was never designed with psychological effects in mind. It was an innovative artillery weapon with a devastating destructive force. However, the sound it produced was so haunting that it instilled fear across ranks of the opposition. Officially called the BM-13, the Katyusha was conceived based on the order of the Soviet Scientific Research Institute 3 to create a rocket launcher on a truck chassis for launching aircraft rockets upon ground targets. Designed under top secrecy, the weapon was first used in 1941 against German trains at Orsha railway station with brutal efficiency. Early reports of its first uses by Red Army commander Andrei Yeremenko described how the rockets, quote, soared up like comets with a red tail and then exploded with a crash like thunder. The effect of the bursts of 320 rockets within a span of 26 seconds in a very limited area exceeded all expectations. The Germans ran away in panic and terror. Admittedly, our own troops withdrew likewise. For security reasons, we had not informed them beforehand about the use of the new weapon, end quote. The Soviets soon nicknamed the weapon Katyusha, most likely after the famous patriotic wartime song. The Germans too had a nickname for the weapon, Stalin's Organs. This was inspired by the loud hissing sound from the incoming rockets, which terrified German troops. Its distinct sound became synonymous with the chaos it would bring. Just one salvo from 4 Katyushas lasted between 7 and 10 seconds and detonated 4.35 tons of high explosive across a 10-acre area. Conclusively, Katyusha was a mighty weapon with dual effectiveness. It brought destruction and created mass fear simultaneously. Number 4. Wandering Soul. During the US-Vietnam War, the Vietnamese believed that when a person died, the body must be buried where they were born, or their soul would forever wander the netherworld. American soldiers working at a South Vietnamese radio station in 1964 saw an opportunity to exploit this belief, and so a series of ominous sounds and voice recordings were created. With the help of South Vietnamese soldiers who imitated the wandering souls of fallen Viet Cong soldiers, these were compiled into the most well-known recording, Ghost Tape Number 10. The recording starts with Buddhist funeral music, followed by the howling sounds of a man in agony. Next, a voice of a little girl calls for her father, a fallen soldier, to come home. This is followed by a distant and echoed voice of her father responding, looking for his loved ones. Finally, the voice of the dead soldier addresses his comrades, telling them he died a senseless death and that he ended up in hell. The recording ends with a message, "Go home, my friends, before it's too late," followed by the groans of a man tormented in hell. The operators were instructed to refrain from playing the tape when in proximity of Allied South Vietnamese soldiers, out of fear it may affect them as well. The success of Operation Wandering Soul was questionable. Viet Cong soldiers quickly realized what they were hearing was a recording, and in turn they used it to locate the enemy's position and aim their fire. As a result, the operation was canceled by 1971. This was not to say that further recordings were not used, such as another recording of a tiger growl also played through loudspeakers. Number 5. Long-Range Acoustic Device, LRAD. The LRAD, or Long-Range Acoustic Device, is often placed in the family of modern sonic weapons. Although its original designers, the American Technology Corporation in 2003, denied it was a weapon, it is nevertheless effectively a sound cannon that can be used to injure, repel, or incapacitate one's target. Its two main abilities are voice amplification for communication over long distances and emitting an alert tone. The alert tone can reach 160 decibels, about 40 decibels louder than the volume of a jet engine taking off. Such a loud sound can cause pain, disorientation, nausea, migraines, and even hearing damage. Police units often use such devices as the LRAD to control large crowds, often during protests. The weapons are relatively small and can therefore be mounted onto vehicles such as automobiles, helicopters, and patrol boats. There are numerous reports of the successful use of LRAD as a sonic weapon coming from countries across the globe. One particularly notable case comes from the Israeli Defense Forces, who used sonic weapons to break Palestinian protesters. U.S. forces have also used them in Iraq, dispersing crowds from locations known to be terrorist targets. Other uses for the weapon include fitting them to cargo ships as protection against pirates. Wherever and however used, it's one of the few modern examples of a powerful and non-lethal sound-based weapon.